Hey guys, my name is Diane Hammonds and I'm presenting on binge eating disorder today. I don't have a partner, so I'm going solo. I'm doing part B, so I'm doing an article summary review, but I'm still going to give a brief overview of the condition. Okay, so an overview of binge eating disorder. While I was reading, I kept reading that one of the really common things was that people confuse this with bulimia a lot. So in binge eating disorder, there's no, they called it compensatory behaviors. So there's no vomiting, there's nothing done to make up for or compensate for the binge eating. And the symptoms are eating a large amount of food. So this is never defined anywhere. It's relative. It's just eating an amount of food that's way bigger than someone else would eat in that similar situation, or like an amount of food that would be expected. There's got to be a sense of a loss of control over your eating or feeling like you can't stop. There could be a feeling of eating very quickly, feeling overly stuffed, and then there's got to be an emotional impact where you're feeling disgusted with yourself or maybe depressed or feeling guilty, and then that causes you to eat alone because of the shame that you feel. Treatments for binge eating disorder. There are a bunch of different treatments, and I think it depends on who you are and how severe it's impacting your life. But people usually do a combination of sometimes medication and psychotherapy, or sometimes people go to group therapy. But for the article review, we'll talk about the effectiveness of treatments and things like that. Causes. So this was interesting to me that researchers don't necessarily know what causes binge eating disorder, but a lot of them hypothesize that it has to do with people attempting to modulate emotions. Not every researcher thinks that, but that seems to be the hypothesis floating around when I was searching for articles. Risk factors. Women are affected more than men, but I was reading that this has led men to being severely underdiagnosed, and that's sometimes men will very obviously present in such a way that they have binge eating disorder, but maybe because prescribers or therapists or professional helpers are not necessarily looking out for a man to have it, that then he doesn't get diagnosed. But there's some degree of heritability common in people in their teens and 20s. They said especially common on college campuses. It was also interesting to me, this third bullet here, that rates are similar across countries and races. I guess in my mind I was thinking that perhaps it was this American culture-bound thing, but it's not. And that traditionally many eating disorders are associated with middle or upper class, thin, younger white women. But because of this has led to people outside of that group being underdiagnosed. So people from LGBTQ population, Asians, Latinos, Black Americans, those people especially being underdiagnosed because of that association, that like traditional pop psychology association. Oh, also I don't want to forget that professionals or athletes, so perhaps ballerinas, professional dancers, people of that sort are more vulnerable or at risk for developing binge eating disorder. So this is the article, Meta-analysis of the efficacy of psychological and medical treatments for binge eating disorder, which I know is a mouthful. But basically, when I was reading about it, the question they're asking is, what treatments are most effective for these folks that have this challenge? And then there's a citation. Okay, so I learned that this article that I chose, there were two psychologists involved, and they completed what is called a meta-analysis. This is when you look at all of the research that's currently been published about a topic, you gather it all together, you run a bunch of tests, that way you can find out trends. And what these psychologists wanted to do was they wanted to find out, okay, of all the studies done on binge eating disorders, what treatments have all the different researchers found to be the most effective. So here are the specifics of like how many studies they looked at in participants, but I thought it was pretty cool that you could do that. Okay, so they focused in on two different major categories of treatments. They focused on psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy. So therapy or medications. They wanted to know which was more effective. And sometimes they also looked at combinations. All right, and here's the juicy findings. They found that overall, out of everything from the 81 studies that they looked at that were published, that cognitive behavioral therapy was the most effective treatment for people with binge eating disorder, which to me was very encouraging because I feel like that's a common psychotherapy treatment that's out there, which means that treatment for people with this challenge is accessible. Okay, so subtypes, they also looked at like humanistic therapy and psychodynamic approach, but CBT was the most effective out of all of them. People who had CBT treatment, they had fewer binge eating episodes and longer periods of abstinence after receiving treatment. And none of the psychotherapies, though, led to any reductions in weight or BMI. I don't know why that is, but that's what they found in the meta-analysis. Okay, and the least effective treatment was just taking medication by itself. So perhaps that means that with binge eating disorder, it has a lot to do with thinking. So cognitions, which influence behaviors. And perhaps it's not solely a biological thing, because if it was, then maybe the meds would fix that right up. Not saying that the meds weren't effective, but just that they were the least effective overall treatment. But that's something interesting. Combining meds and psychotherapy led to a decreased treatment dropout rate. And one thing that I was reading in the article, the authors said that they noticed that dropout rates spiked severely when they looked at control groups compared to groups that began psychotherapy for binge eating disorder. So there was a group of people gathered together as a control group. They weren't receiving any therapy for it, so there were no dropout rates. But as soon as the psychotherapy began for the people in the group with binge eating disorder, that the dropout rates doubled. But when they received psychotherapy combined with medication, it brought those dropout rates down again, which is interesting. Okay, so again, for medications, people who were treated for binge eating disorder with medications, it did decrease BMI and body weight, which is interesting to note, but it also makes sense because stimulants have that effect, weight loss. But it did not decrease harmful beliefs about body image and eating. So I would imagine that would be very problematic for someone to have some harmful beliefs about body image and then to be taking a medication that helps them lose a lot of weight. Perhaps it would be reinforcing for them. I don't know. That's just my thought. And then antidepressants relieved harmful beliefs but did not impact the BMI or weight. Okay, more findings, but this is the last findings page. They found that people who received this treatment, so like psychotherapy or medications, when they came together in a group, that treatment was significantly more effective than people that just received the treatment one-on-one, which I think speaks to the power of having peer support, knowing that you're not alone, just feeling the comfort of somebody else going through something scary with you or something really challenging together with you, experiencing failures together, experiencing success together. So that's encouraging. Shorter treatments were more effective in lowering the number of binge eating episodes. So when treatments were less than 10 weeks, it was more effective for people. I don't know why that is. Maybe you can meditate on it, but the shorter treatments were more effective. Okay, limitations of the study. So because this was a meta-analysis, the authors did not have access to all of the information about people's sex and their gender and their religion and their race and all of these other factors to tease out the specifics of what made everyone different. from each other and what treatments helped who in particular. They couldn't tease any of that out. They were just grabbing information from studies already completed and then compiling it. It would be super helpful if they could have that information. The findings would probably be way more detailed and give a lot more insight into people groups and who particular is helped by what therapy. But they didn't have that. So that's a limitation to keep in mind of a meta-analysis. And I think in general, that's always a limitation of that type of study. Okay, so here are some resources. I actually used a couple of these when I was looking for information to try to guide me. Some of them are very general, but then others of them are very in-depth, like the National Eating Disorders Association. This gives very in-depth information, and I'd highly recommend looking at it, about all types of eating disorders, their specific treatments, causes, risk factors, symptoms, and they use the DSM diagnostic criteria, which is super cool. So it's a very official and informative website, very helpful. And then here are just a few other reputable resources for if you ever wanted to look up something like this. It's very common for people, college-age folks, so I think it's a good resource to look at. I'm saying a lot. I apologize. Okay, and here are my references. Use the DSM a lot in the beginning, and then the final one is the study, and the middle one is the Johns Hopkins website that I looked at for some information. Thanks for viewing my presentation. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something that CBT is super effective for our folks who struggle with binge eating disorder. That group therapy is very helpful for those folks as well, and that combined with meds, it can help lower dropout rates for these folks. So thanks for coming to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Okay.